On a February morning in 1947, at 9 a.m. in Washington, the British ambassador, Lord Inverchapel, arrived at the office of U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall. He carried printed copies of two diplomatic messages. One dealt with Greece, and the other focused on Turkey. These messages were printed on blue paper to highlight their importance. At that moment, Britain was exhausted and drowning in heavy debt to the United States. It informed Washington that it could no longer sustain its support for the Greek military, which was engaged in combat against an armed communist uprising. Earlier, Britain had already announced plans to withdraw from Palestine and India and to end its presence in Egypt. The United States quickly recognized the gravity of the situation. If Greece fell under communist control, it would effectively come under Soviet influence. American policymakers feared that if Greece aligned with the Soviet Union, Turkey could follow a similar path. This would give Moscow strategic control over the Eastern Mediterranean and potentially allow it to dominate crucial global trade routes, including the Suez Canal. Almost overnight, the United States moved to fill the void left by Britain. The Truman Doctrine, President Harry Truman announced the United States should have a policy of supporting free peoples, resisting subjugation by armed minorities or external pressures. This marked the start of the era later called the Truman Doctrine. It was founded on the principle that defending democracy abroad was essential to U.S. national interests. Two major initiatives emerged under this policy. First, the Marshall Plan, providing substantial aid packages for the reconstruction of Europe's shattered economies. Second, the formation of NATO in 1949, designed to protect European democracies from the Soviet Union, which had expanded its influence over Eastern Europe. This moment can be seen as the point when global leadership of the Western world shifted from Britain to the United States. Historically, America, safely positioned between two oceans and traditionally inclined toward isolationism, emerged as the leader of the free world after World War II. Its wartime demonstration of power laid the groundwork for post-war influence across much of the globe. The generation born during the post-war baby boom grew up in a world increasingly shaped by American culture, values, and behavior. The United States became the cultural, economic, and military center of the Western world. Yet the foundational assumptions on which U.S. geostrategic ambitions rested now appear to be shifting. The United States, Europe, and the current global context. America's stance on Western security represents the most significant challenge for European countries since the end of World War II. Analysts suggest this crisis is far from temporary. Many believe Trumpism will outlast Trump's presidency by years. As the United States retreats in various arenas, the question arises, which nations are prepared to step forward? Donald Trump is the first post-World War II U.S. president to challenge the role America has historically assumed in global security. His actions have left many feeling that the old world order has dissolved, while a new world order has yet to emerge. Which countries will fill the emerging vacuum? Can European leaders facing unprecedented pressure find effective solutions as they attempt to navigate this complex landscape? Truman's legacy and Trump's critique. Trump's criticisms of the post-1945 world order have a long history. Nearly 40 years ago, he placed full-page ads in major U.S. newspapers, questioning America's commitment to defending democracies worldwide. In 1987, he wrote that Japan and other nations had benefited from the U.S. for decades. He asked why these countries were not compensating the United States for the billions spent protecting lives and safeguarding their interests. He criticized American politicians, noting, "The world mocks us because we defend ships that aren't ours, transporting oil we do not need, for allies who refuse to support us." Trump revived this stance during his second term. Leaked messages regarding U.S. airstrikes in Yemen emphasized Europe's reliance on American military power, provoking responses within his administration. Messages sent in Vice President J.D. Vance's name indicated that European nations might benefit from these operations, stating, "I hate bailing Europe out again." 3 minutes later, an account identified as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth responded, saying the VP completely agrees with your disdain for European freeloading. It is truly frustrating. Trump's criticism is less about individuals and more about those whom he perceives as exploiting U.S. generosity. Early in his second term, he was seen embracing Russian President Vladimir Putin, asserting that Ukraine would not join NATO, and warning Ukraine not to expect the return of territories lost to Russia. Many interpreted this as a substantial concession before any negotiations, while Trump appeared to demand nothing in return from Russia. Some of his supporters saw Putin as a strong leader who shares conservative values, and some even viewed him as an ally in a fight against entrenched privileges. U.S. foreign policy now partially reflects the demands of its cultural priorities. Europe's security is caught between two conflicting American doctrines. Some observers argue these changes extend beyond Trump personally and that Europe cannot simply wait for his tenure to end. Ed Arnold, senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, said, "America is increasingly separating itself from European values. This is difficult for Europe to accept because it is a long-term and culturally significant shift." He added, "I believe America's current trajectory will continue even after Trump. Trumpism is likely to persist beyond his presidency." NATO's Article 5 under strain. The White House has indicated it will no longer serve as Europe's primary guarantor of security. European countries must now take responsibility for their own defense and fund it accordingly. In 2025, Trump stated, "If NATO members do not pay, I will not defend them. No, I will not defend them." Nearly 80 years ago, European security was anchored in NATO's Article 5, which asserts an attack on any member state constitutes an attack on all. British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer said in a 2025 interview that he is confident in America's leadership within NATO, and that Trump is personally committed to Article 5. However, others remain skeptical. Ben Wallace, former British Defense Secretary, said, "I think Article 5 is on life support. If Europe, including Britain, does not step up, invest in defense, and take it seriously, NATO as we know it could collapse, along with Article 5. He added, "I cannot assume that Article 5 would automatically activate in the event of a Russian attack. I would not rely on the United States to defend us." A survey by the French company Institut Lab found that nearly 3/4 of French citizens now believe the United States is no longer a reliable ally. A majority in Britain and a very large majority in Denmark share similar views, even though both countries historically supported the U.S. Robert Kagan, conservative commentator, longtime Trump critic, author, and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, said Trump has inflicted potentially irreversible damage on NATO. At a minimum, the alliance relied on an American guarantee that is no longer dependable. Still, Trump is not the first U.S. president to urge Europe to organize its own defense spending. In 2016, Barack Obama emphasized the need for NATO allies to increase contributions, noting that Europe had at times become too complacent about its defense. Is the West fragmenting? For Russian President Vladimir Putin, these developments are encouraging. Last year, he warned that the entire Euro-Atlantic security system was collapsing. Europe had fallen behind in global economic growth, struggled with migration challenges, and was losing international influence and cultural identity. 3 days after a high-profile White House meeting involving Trump, Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a Kremlin spokesperson declared, "The West has begun to fragment." Armida van Rij, head of the European program at Chatham House, noted Russia's objectives in Europe are clear: destabilize Europe, weaken NATO, and push the Americans to withdraw their forces. At this point, all you can do is watch the clock tick. Europe is becoming unstable. NATO is weakening. While the U.S. has not yet withdrawn its troops from Europe, who knows what could happen in the coming months? Forgetting the lessons of history. A major challenge for Europe is properly arming itself. 8 decades of reliance on American power have left many European nations exposed. Britain, for example, has reduced defense spending by roughly 70% since the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, in the early 1990s, Europe began a long process of cutting defense budgets, taking advantage of a period of relative peace. Wallace explained, "During the Cold War, we had a large budget and leveraged peace. Now, one can debate whether that was necessary. The problem is, the gains from peace turned into corporate gains, and defense became just a department from which to extract money. This is where we forgot the lessons of history. The Prime Minister stated, Britain plans to increase defense spending from 2.3% of GDP to 2.5% by 2027, but questions remain about sufficiency. Wallace said, standing still is not enough. These measures alone will not correct the problems or fill the gap if the Americans withdraw. We need to make ourselves more deployable. Military recruitment is another concern. Wallace noted, the West is facing recruitment failures, and this is not limited to Britain. Young people are not joining the military, and this is a serious issue. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz emphasized that Europe should become more independent from the U.S., advocating for a European-style NATO, with its own local military-industrial complex, a capability currently held only by the U.S. Some observers agree Europe needs greater self-sufficiency in defense, though there is concern that not all European countries are on the same page. Ian Bond, deputy director at the Center for European Reform, said, in Eastern Europe, there is no need to persuade nations, but the further west you go, to Spain and Italy, the harder it becomes. Arnold concurred, the debate in Europe is no longer whether action is necessary, but how and how quickly it should be implemented. Regardless, action is needed now. Building a new world order. Historian Timothy Garton Ash highlights a short list of critical capabilities currently provided only by the United States. These include satellites, intelligence systems, and Patriot air defense batteries capable of intercepting Russian ballistic missiles. Within 3 to 5 years, countries beyond the U.S. should have their own versions. During this transition, a NATO alliance independent of U.S. command could emerge, fully European, capable in cooperation with EU capabilities of defending the continent. The question remains, how can this be achieved? Von Rey stresses the need for a European defense industrial base, but sees obstacles. The real challenge is that there is disagreement within Europe about how to achieve this, and even whether it should be done. For decades, the European Commission and experts have studied how a European defense system could work. National interests have historically made this very difficult. It will not be easy. Meanwhile, Trump appears ready to overturn the post-Cold War world order, based on sovereign states free to choose alliances. He and Putin share a vision of a world where major powers impose their will on smaller nations, without adhering to international agreements, signaling a potential return to spheres of influence that lasted for 40 years after World War II. It is unclear how Trump would respond if NATO members were attacked, but reliance on American guarantees can no longer be assumed. Europe will need to respond, remain united, fund its own defense, and avoid the sphere of influence of any major power, challenges that will define the coming decades. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to US Mag and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinion.